So a very good evening to colleagues, current and former students, and guests who are joining us online. Thank you for making the time to join the School of English for our very first research talk for the academic year, and the first in-person one since the pandemic. It's a privilege to share my work with all of you today. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded to the School of English's Facebook page and YouTube channel for those who can't be with us this evening. At the first glance, the title of my talk may seem perhaps paradoxical. After all, the language of women's empowerment, of equality, diversity, and inclusion encodes almost universal positive values. Although people may not agree about what these concepts mean in practice, as abstract notions, they are desirable goals that would be difficult to disagree with. So why would such a language need to be interrogated? The problem is not with the lexicon per se, but how this language has been appropriated and emptied out of its political meaning. As Andrea Cornwall points out, terms like empowerment, participation, progress, and justice have become buzzwords across various domains: business, management, development, advertising. And in the process, their semantic range has expanded to include meanings that are radically different from what the feminists that popularized their use had in mind. The language of women's empowerment, equality, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI, now embraces different agendas and often valorizes individualistic rather than collective goals. But this is often left unquestioned because of the language's warm, persuasive qualities. And when its true political meanings are repressed, this can stand in the way of real structural change. Recently, Yoong and Rhodes published a study exploring why, after decades of EDI laws, policies, and strategies, equality and diversity remain difficult to achieve in Western organizations. The problem they found is that although companies talk a lot about promoting equality, many have lost sight of what it truly means as they translate a political project with emancipatory goals into a managerial project focused on profits and financial growth. In another study, Kalpana Wilson used the example of the non-profit organization Girl Effect to illustrate how the selective adoption of feminist thinking within development discourse can deepen gender inequality. In their video Smart Economics, a hypothetical girl in rural Ethiopia is portrayed as having to do 5 times as many chores as her brother at the expense of her studies. The feminist issue of unequal division of housework is highlighted, but later mitigated by, quote unquote, empowering this hypothetical girl with a fuel-efficient stove without any redistribution of domestic work. We next see her simultaneously cooking and studying. This, Wilson argues, constructs a seemingly liberated, hyper-industrious, entrepreneurial female subject, but it raises questions of gendered divisions of labor. Concepts relating to women's empowerment and equality are often invoked by state and development actors in their efforts to increase women's participation in the market economy. Raising female employment numbers is a matter of considerable concern for many governments, as it is seen as vital to secure growth and become more competitive. Within the Southeast and East Asian region, many states have introduced various policies and programs to harness women's quote-unquote underutilized labor. These are often packaged in a language of women's empowerment. For example, Japan's womenomics policies are presented in the government's website as a strategy to create an environment where women can demonstrate their power to the fullest extent. Nevertheless, despite their seemingly pro-women stance, such state initiatives are often ultimately motivated by national competitiveness. Scholars within gender studies, development studies, anthropology, and political economy have long criticized how women's empowerment is spoken and written about. However, there is a paucity of linguistic analysis examining this, and none that I know in this part of the world. My talk this evening, which draws on part of my recently published study, contributes to filling this gap. This talk looks at how two Malaysian state-linked websites employ a language of DDI and women's empowerment in order to attract high-potential mothers on career breaks to return to formal work, and in the process, reinforce gender inequalities as well as existing hierarchies of class and citizenship and non-citizenship. To give some context to my study, only around 55% of prime-age women are in the Malaysian labour market, in contrast to approximately 82% of working-age men. Institutional reports have diagnosed women's caregiving roles as a fundamental cause of this. In line with this, government efforts to increase women's employment rate have focused on mother-friendly measures. For example, since 2006, Malaysia's 5-year development plans have offered an unwavering limited diet of solutions, namely expanding childcare services and introducing work-family integration practices such as flexible work arrangements and work-from-home policies. However, these efforts have not been that successful in helping women to stay and progress in the workplace. There is still a shortage of affordable and accessible care for children and the elderly, as the government has been reluctant to increase spending to truly transform social care services. Further, men are not encouraged to take their fair share of unpaid care. Also, motherhood is not the sole reason why women leave the workforce. A recent study that I conducted with Nohan Muhammad identifies workplace push factors, such as unrealistically high workloads and tight deadlines and unhealthy work environments. As long as these are not addressed, women continue to confront the double burden of spending long hours in the workplace on top of being responsible for greater reproductive labor at home. The two websites that my study explores, namely Flex Work Life and Talent Matters, constitute part of the Malaysian government's efforts to increase female workforce participation. Both are developed by Talent Corporation Malaysia, or Talent Corp, a government agency established to attract and retain quote-unquote talent in order to transform the country into a high-income economy. The websites contained dedicated web pages for women, which positions this group as an important target for intervention to enhance Malaysia's talent pool. Notably, these women's sections comprise almost entirely of a set of articles called Career Comeback Stories. These largely feature women who have returned to corporate life after taking time out to raise children. The role of these stories is to persuade caregivers on career breaks to returning to the workforce is a good idea. These stories are framed as narratives of empowerment to inspire women to live a fulfilling life and to realize their potential. 41 career comeback stories were retrieved from the two websites, and they were approached from a critical discourse analysis perspective to examine their ideological and persuasive properties. This study takes the premise that the articles are saturated with the ideologies of those with the power to define what is normal, acceptable, and ideal for women. These ideologies serve the interests of some and sustain unequal relations of power. Undoubtedly, the reader is capable of resisting the perspectives conveyed in the text, but the assumption in the present work is that these messages may not be obviously problematic and could even seem progressive because they are wrapped up in a vocabulary of diversity, inclusion, and women's empowerment. The intent of this analysis is to demystify the dominant ideologies expressed through seemingly emancipatory language. I also applied neoliberal feminism as a theoretical framework. Neoliberal feminism, as conceptualized by Katrin Rothenberg, is a relatively new variant of feminism that acknowledges that gender inequalities exist, but view emancipation as an individual woman's ability to combine a successful career with a fulfilling family life. Aspirational middle-class women are incited to pursue work-family balance and personal happiness through self-tailored solutions. It is this turn inward, away from collective action and toward the self, that differentiates this strand of feminism from other variants. The neoliberal feminist subject is expected to take it upon herself to manage issues of childcare and family life and not demand anything from the state or men as a group. In consequence, the burden of reproductive labor remains on the shoulders of individual women. My analysis shows that the career comeback stories present the individual achievement of work-family balance and well-being, that is, feelings of fulfillment, self-confidence, and personal growth as the ultimate goal for women. Of course, being able to combine care and paid work and lead a satisfying life is important. The issue here is not balance, but the way the stories normalize this as an end in itself, which detracts from the need for wider social changes for greater gender equality. The happy work-family balance discourse is often articulated through a can-do language that endows women with agency and self-determination. In these examples, the modal auxiliary can expresses certainty that women are able to have the best of both worlds and do everything. In other words, these clauses have the illocutionary force of a promise to women that balance is within their grasp. They interpolate a subject who is aspirational, empowered, and autonomous, which erases the systemic barriers that hinder women as a group from having equal opportunities to pursue a career. The stories repeatedly use a vocabulary of positive affect to reinforce the message that mothers are most likely to find happiness by joining the labor market. According to Rothenberg, emotional and psychological well-being has become an important signifier of success in neoliberal societies. As such, we can argue that this lexicon of well-being indexes empowerment. In other words, by presenting employment as the route to confidence and fulfillment, the stories are also urging mothers to empower themselves by re-entering the workplace. Such stories at first sight appear to encourage women to exert control over their life trajectories. They interpolate an empowered subject who takes charge of her happiness. However, the language encourages a depoliticized and individualized mindset, as it directs women toward the goal of reaching their personal happiness within the status quo and away from reimagining gender roles, systems of care, and the world of work in new ways that could benefit society collectively. Women's empowerment is to be attained by participating in capitalist systems rather than through social transformation. The notion that mothers are the primary parents also features strongly in the data. Whereas the idea of shared caregiving between husbands and wives are rarely articulated. In both websites, mothers are expected to achieve the delicate balance between career and mothering through personal initiatives, careful calibration, home-based care arrangements, and flexible work benefits. All this contributes to the sustenance of the dominant ideology in Malaysia that caregiving is a female and private matter. I'll give you half a minute to look at these examples. In these examples, women are the sole social actors who benefit from family-friendly policies and practices that can help better balance personal and professional responsibilities. There is no mention of men benefiting from such arrangements, which implies that they do not need to carry their fair share of care load. Thus, the family status quo is left unchallenged. At the same time, these policies and practices are articulated with the key liberal terms progressive, diversity, inclusion, empower, and change. This aligns the policies and practices with ideas of gender equality, social reform, and egalitarianism. The feel-good connotations of these buzzwords can potentially obscure the fact that women are still expected to be the primary caregiver. This sanctification of family-friendly initiatives also flattens out class differences among women. While family-friendly practices are undoubtedly important and necessary, they remain the preserve of professional middle-class women. Positioning them with diversity and inclusion as if they are available to all women forecloses discussion on more comprehensive solutions that could benefit women across social classes and are not reliant on corporate goodwill. Although the stories normalize childcare as women's responsibility, they are largely silent about the actual reproductive labor that career mothers perform alongside their paid work. This has long been a worldwide issue where the significant time and energy that women spend on caring work and household chores are routinely ignored and unaccounted for. When the articles do describe the strategies that women employ to manage their double burden, it is to illustrate that flexible work arrangements can empower women with greater control over tensions between the demands of care and career. In these extracts, the women again are the sole actors carrying out caregiving actions and adjusting their work schedules to meet their parenting and professional obligations. As with the previous examples, the linguistic absence of references to fathers positions mothers as the main parent. By presenting the women as active agents of their various actions, the stories depict them as entrepreneurial subjects who, enabled by flexible work arrangements, are consciously choosing to create the life they desire and proactively crafting such a life through continuous labor and perseverance. Behavior that, according to Rothenberg, signifies empowerment and achievement within neoliberal feminism. The accounts of women's long working hours offer a glimpse of how flexibility subverts its promise of freedom and empowerment by, to quote Chamberlain, compelling workers to adapt to the demands of the market and employers, and by enabling work to envelop life. Nonetheless, uncoupled from social structural considerations, these depictions fetishize flexibility and individual efficiency and encourage employed mothers to cultivate a spirit of self-optimization. Positive representations of flexible work prevail in state, organizational and media discourses around the world. Global feminist scholars have argued that this diverts attention from governments in resolving the unpaid care impasse. According to Nash and Churchill, this keeps women tethered to caring and domestic sphere in ways that men are still not, while placing the onus on them to manage their professional and family responsibilities. Gregg argues that flexible work arrangements do not change workplace or household cultures, but merely enable the opportunity to move long hours around. So far, we have discussed how the career comeback stories use a language that evokes women's empowerment, equality, and inclusion to encourage mothers to combine family with career. This language use obscures the underlying gender and class inequalities. The linguistic practices in the career comeback stories also reinforce stratifications between well-educated women citizens and migrant domestic workers. To improve women's availability for paid employment, Malaysia has in recent decades introduced migrant domestic workers through lenient migration policies. Engaging migrant domestic workers has become an important care option for many middle-class professional women. Pre-COVID, thousands of poor women would arrive in Malaysia each year to take up domestic work. They are highly vulnerable to physical violence and sexual abuse due to the private nature of their site of work. Further, because their labor takes place in a home environment, it is often regarded not as real professional work, but as an extension of women's quote-unquote natural domestic duties. They have long been unprotected by employment laws and consequently often face exploitation such as non or underpayment, long working hours, and inadequate rest time. Given the importance of migrant domestic workers for middle-class Malaysian women navigating career and family responsibilities, we can reasonably expect them to be present in the career comeback stories. However, they are only mentioned very briefly in 5 articles. In other words, there's a salient absence around these migrant women. Whilst women citizens are portrayed as upwardly mobile, empowered subjects, as we saw earlier, migrant domestic workers invisibly provide low-wage reproductive work. These examples show the contrast between how Malaysian women and migrant domestic workers are represented in the stories. In the first extract, the prepositional phrase, in between maids, casts the migrant workers not as full human beings, but commodities that are indistinguishable from and interchangeable with each other. The term maids, which is widely used in Malaysia and other countries in this region, strips them of their personhood. It invokes the live-in maids that were once prevalent in Chinese culture and were regarded as the property of their masters. The second account is about a woman who was attending a career comeback program when her domestic worker left. The fact that her employee had run away is presented as trivial contextual information in a causal adjunct. In Malaysia, recruitment agencies often retain migrant domestic workers' passports when they arrive in the country. Live-in workers who leave their place of employment lose their legal status, income, and home. They also risk arrest and deportation. Thus, by backgrounding these serious events and describing it as a mini crisis, the text suppresses the worker's perspective. In fact, grammatically, the possessive relationship had is encoded from the point of view of the employer. There is no indication of any concern for the worker's well-being. Instead, the rest of the sentence focuses on the employer's resilience, adaptability, and journey to empowerment. The brief segments that mention migrant domestic workers are always from the standpoint of the needs and convenience of middle-class professional women. This reproduces social understandings of the migrant women as disposable means for capital-enhancing Malaysians to achieve their goals. This shows how language that promotes women's empowerment and inclusion can also reinforce stratifications between well-educated women citizens and their low-wage migrant counterparts in the global household. So through the examples that are provided in the previous slides, we have seen how Talent Corp, a government organization, uses a language of empowerment and equality to attract more women back into the workforce in order to strengthen Malaysia's position in the global market. The career comeback stories articulate the neoliberal feminist happy work-family balance discourse, which encourages women to improve their personal well-being by combining motherhood with professional accomplishment. Deploying neoliberal feminism as a discourse strategy safeguards both the national competitiveness projects and Asian values that dictate that childcare is the responsibility of the family, principally the mother. By inscribing balance as the ideal for progressive womanhood, the discourse supports state efforts to bring more women into the workforce while ensuring they continue to play the central role in child raising, in line with the traditional and moralistic gendered discourses in Malaysian society. Crucially, the individualistic empowerment expressed in the language of the discourse obscures the gender inequalities underlying the career comeback initiatives. The pressure on women to be both present mothers and ideal workers, whose productivity is unimpeded by caregiving duties, is repackaged as emancipation, self-care, efficiency, rather than being questioned. This helps to keep social disenchantment in check and produce an industrious, self-motivated workforce, which is good for economic growth. From a social change perspective, however, the idealized representations of contented, productive, self-actualizing career mothers are problematic as they implicitly confirm the quote-unquote empowering potential of measures which in actual fact deepen rather than undermine gender arrangements in Malaysian households. This is both a local problem and a global one. Cornwall argues that discourses of women's empowerment in international development contribute towards sustaining a traditional family model in which women are those who do the caring. For all the encouragement to enter the labor market, empowered women may find no relief in expectations that they will provide unpaid care work at home. What used to be spoken as a double burden is now called empowerment. Hence, linguists play an important role in interrogating the linguistic wrapping of gender, employment, and development initiatives, both in Malaysia and beyond, and exposing the patriarchal model of family care that lies beneath their shiny veneer. By speaking the language of empowerment and inclusion, Talent Corp's career comeback stories invisibilize not only gender inequalities, but existing hierarchies of class and citizenship and non-citizenship. As Elias has pointed out, it is middle-class women's workforce participation that's regarded as a catalyst for Malaysia's global competitiveness and growth. Gender equality policy interventions have centered on a middle-class, educated, urban female subject, whereas specific groups of racialized citizens and non-citizen women working at home or for households as domestic workers are continually undervalued and unrecognized. Resonating with these observations, the career comeback stories exclusively address relatively affluent women who are able to prioritize cultivating positive affect, personal growth, and a well-rounded life, and who have access to flexible work arrangements. Missing from the conversation are less privileged women who need to work for basic financial reasons but cannot afford child or elder care, or who are not likely to be in jobs that offer family-friendly benefits. However, drawing on a language that evokes diversity and women's empowerment can create a warmly persuasive, though false, impression that the state initiative serves all women equally, thereby further instilling middle-class needs as the yardstick to measure gender equality. This necessitates applied linguistics research that can expose the ways in which mainstream buzzwords insulate and entrench the privileged status that the middle classes enjoy in narratives of development, not only in Malaysia, but also within the global South more generally. We also need to bring transnational household workers' textual absences into presence to shine light on their important laboring roles within global circuits of capital accumulation. Finally, there are opportunities for state and development actors that can pave way for interventions that would better support women in all regions. While the gender issues at the interface of work, family, development, and migration discussed in this study have emerged from Malaysia's particular geopolitical circumstances, variations of these problems occur in many other national contexts. At the same time, the international language of women's empowerment has become prominent in policy making, as noted earlier. As such, government and development agencies across geographical settings need to re-evaluate the ways in which the lexicon of equality and empowerment have come to be used in their gender and work discourse. This includes reflecting on their deployment of words such as balance, diversity, and inclusion, reflecting on how these words silence structural inequalities and detracts attention from self-scrutiny regarding their country's gender issues, and accordingly from the possibility of real lasting change. Hilary Standing argues that it is naive to expect bureaucrats to be either willing or able to carry out the transformative work that those who advocate the adoption of radical concepts expect of them. Nonetheless, it is important for linguists to continue to promote the possibility of conversations about how the language of empowerment can be reclaimed to serve the cause of social justice and structural change. Thank you.